How about transitions? Transitions and relationships.
Okay, come on in. Sorry to block off the way there.
People change. Has anyone noticed?
All right.
All right, you guys ready to play a little game?
Okay.
All right, let's play. Name that transition.
They're pretty simple. Don't worry.
I'll start with an easy one. Marriage. Yeah.
No, sending them off. They come back.
Huh? New job, yeah. This, I Googled promotion, and this is a picture that came up, so. Yeah, he does look happy. All right.
You can't learn to drive.
Yeah. Yeah. All right, so what a lot of you have picked up on already, and I'm glad for that, is that there's more than one transition in each thing, right? Like someone mentioned in-laws, and so this person handing over the key, are they having a transition too? Probably so, right? And the boss is having a transition, and the other people who seem to not be promoted, it seems like they're not going anywhere, but they are having a transition because they're having a different relationship to that person that got promoted, right? And his family could be having a different transition too, right? Like, especially if he has to work different hours or travel, his travel schedule is different or whatever. So one person changes, they all deal with that transition, right?
Could have fallen through.
Right. And in this picture, you know, that person, she's already been experiencing a transition, right? She's been losing her old relationship in a way, the old way of relating to her friend. And that doesn't mean that the friendship is over, but it does mean that if she's not able to adapt, then it could be over, right? I mean, things could, yeah. Yeah, then she needs to learn how to continue that relationship in a different way if she wants it to survive, right? If she wants it to continue. So, in Genesis 2, God created marriage, and in that way, God also kind of created a relationship transition. And Adam had the transition, Eve, as they got married, and it says that continues down through the generations as a man leaves his father and mother, becomes united to his wife. And that was even before the bad stuff, came in Genesis chapter 3. So transitions in relationships are not something to hate or to be afraid of or avoid at all costs, but they are something that we need to learn to deal with, right, and to use and to embrace.
So today, there's no way we could cover how all transitions affect all relationships. But what we're going to do is we're going to use these, the ones that were in the photos, as kind of touch points for us to talk about how they affect relationships, and then hopefully give some principles that can be applied to different transitions and relationship transitions. Now, some transitions are just relationship transitions in a lot of ways, right? Like getting married or dating or getting divorced. Those kinds of things are just real relationship transitions. It's a transition that's just in a relationship. Now, but there are other transitions that just affect relationships. Like, for example, someone in a family starts a new career. I meant to check out the Berenstain Bears' Mama's New Job, You can tell I've been a parent, mostly for the past 18 years, but I always bring the children's books. But Mama got a job, and it affects everybody in the family, right? It affected the amount of time that they spend with her. It affected who does the just different household chores in the family, all those kinds of things. So career change, even though that's not something that we think of as a relationship change, it affects our relationships, right? A change of beliefs, more or less independence is a big one, and we're going to talk about that in a second. Every transition has an ending, a neutral zone, and a beginning. And relationship transitions are just like that. That there's going to be something that's ending, And then there's going to be maybe some disorientation, some time where you don't really know what's going on or what the new footing in the relationship might be. And then there's going to be a beginning in which you're investing in the new normal. You're investing in the new situation, and you've let go of the old habits and the old situation the way it used to be. Okay?
Can I just say one more thing
Yeah.
about this? Sometimes when I think of these three, I think I call them grieving and deciding what to let go of, and finding contentment in trusting God, and investing and initiating. So you can think of it as stages, but you can also think of it as three skills or three jobs that need to be done with any transition.
Absolutely. And those are great ways to think about them. So let's go back to this. We have here a child becoming an adult. And that is a personal transition, right? And we talked about that a couple weeks ago, how that affects a person. But it also affects everybody like around that person, right? So you have mama or papa as they're watching a person gain independence and freedom. Sorry, this is terrible. You're not going to be able to see this at all. Okay, so they're gaining independence and they're gaining freedom. And especially for parents who have spent a lot of time carting their child around, or spent a lot of time investing in their activities and in their lives, or gone through a time when they had a lot of control over what their child did. Okay, this is a huge transition for that parent in their relationship. And for a lot of people, I know when people ask me what I do, which is a question that I just always struggle with, I always look at them like, how am I supposed to answer that? I have no idea. And but I often end up saying I'm a mom. And that's part of my identity. It's how I invest a lot of my time. And so for this kid, they're becoming independent, and they're not needing mom so much or dad so much. And then you have mom down here, and she might be thinking, what now? Right? And so that's a transition for not just the kid who's becoming an adult, it's a transition for the parents as well, and it's a transition on how they relate to their kid. And so relationships, they cannot stay the same. And really no relationship does stay the same. They're meant to change. And from the very beginning, children were meant to grow and gain freedom and become independent. So those relationships, we have to give them to God. We have to trust God with them. Let our loved ones change. And learn that the old way of relating might not work anymore. In Rochelle, my daughter, she's 12. She was in growing and changing class, right? And she said that the teacher asked, how many of you are having more conflict with your parents right now than you used to have? And she said, everybody but 2 people raised their hand. And why would that be? Well, kid is growing up and relationship has not adjusted yet, right? And so there's a relationship transition there that's going on, and sometimes there's some conflict that happens because of that relationship transition.
It seems like sometimes for teenagers not knowing how to do that transition, they know how to cause conflict, and that is a way to change that relationship. When my girls got to be teenagers, I wasn't sure if they thought I knew how to peel potatoes anymore. I got dumber and dirt in their eyes, but they just don't know how to make that transition in a way that there's no conflict. And I'll say one more thing about transition. You've got a different marker there. Would you please use it?
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Mark brought that for you. I think it
Okay.
worked.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sounds good. Sounds good. All right. Okay, so
So
a lot of...
Can I just say something about what she said?
Yeah.
So it's true that a lot of times teenagers do struggle with that, and we can pray for them and help them. Yeah. And I think what Diane is also saying is that a lot of times, like, parents don't realize that they also need to, that the teenager can't help but change in some way, and the parent needs to adjust to it, and to learn to leave some old ways of relating behind. Same with, like right now, like last night, Rochelle and Faith, were you planning to talk about this?
Go ahead.
You know, Faith was talking to us about how Rochelle is acting different now. And, you know, it's not that Rochelle maybe is doing everything perfect, but we understand that in some ways she has to act differently. And Faith needs to be able to accept that and to adjust to that. So Rochelle's, did I mention Rochelle's 12? So Diane was saying that, you know, at age 12, often kids start to want a little bit more independence. And Faith is 9. And Faith just started crying and saying, then what happens to me?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Exactly. So it's not just the parent who might say, what now? Right? And that's a real neutral zone feeling. When you're saying to yourself, what now? Well, you're in a neutral zone probably is what's going on. And that's a time when we really invest in trusting in God and letting a relationship go to God, because maybe it's not going to have the same footing that it had. And we do need to kind of let go of that, but we do need to expect that something else is going to begin in that relationship, and that we can trust Him to form an even more mature relationship along the road, and that can be even better. And so it's a faith exercise. You know, it's an exercise of our character. It's an exercise of our trust. A lot of people have talked about how in parenting you go through a series of transitions. You go from being the commander, where, you know, do this, come here, do that, and then to being a coach, to being a counselor, to being a consultant. And your relationship with that kid is changing over time. Sometimes the ending side of this is sometimes we struggle with letting things go because they were good, right? Like, we had a relationship, our best friend, we did stuff together all of the time, and we loved that, and it was so fun. And then they started dating this guy, right? And suddenly they weren't spending all their time with just us, or he was all along for the ride, right? And we have trouble letting go of what was. We have trouble letting go of something that was good and that we're going to miss. And so, and then we have trouble knowing, well, what's going to be like now? Because this has changed. But Ecclesiastes says, don't just think, why were the old days better than these? It's not wise to ask such questions. Like, if you just only focus on the way things used to be, then you're not going to be able to look for the new thing that God is doing in your life and in your relationship. And so we talked about here, you're gaining independence, kids gaining independence, kids becoming adults, how that might affect their parents. Let's talk about another thing, losing independence. Because that happens a lot of times in relationships also. That a person, you have a person who's gained independence, and now we're all on the level playing field here. We're all adults. We're doing our own thing. And our culture, my culture, I'm from Western Kansas, we value independence. And then something happens. A person loses their job, or a person has an accident, or a person has a health problem. And then they end up shifting from being an independent person to a person who needs help. That is a relationship transition that is very hard to do gracefully and can take a lot of, yeah? There's something to say about that?
You showed the picture of the father handing the teenager keys.
Uh-huh.
I thought, yeah, and someday that teenager's going to grow up, and he's going to have to say, Dad, you can't drive anymore. And he has to tell him that's a tougher relationship.
Yes.
When you lose your independence as an older person,
Uh-huh.
you shouldn't be driving, and your kids realize he's dangerous, like he's going to hurt himself or someone else, and they take the keys away from Dad.
Yes,
That's
absolutely. And we're actually going to talk about that very
sorry, I
thing.
didn't
Yes.
mean to jump
No,
in.
thank you for bringing it up, because that's where we're headed here, is that losing of independence can be a very hard transition to make. And that's why we have this picture here, because these look like two very young, vibrant, healthy young adults, right? This is a really sweet couple that Marcus she was a peer guide in his class that he taught at Harding. And they had been married for about a year when her husband had a terrible accident. And he was in a coma for several months. And when he woke up, he was mentally the same person, amazing, just wonderful, that he can still think, his personality's still intact, everything's still there. He couldn't speak, he couldn't walk, he couldn't use his arms normally. And he's still in that state to a large degree, although he's gaining some ability to use his body again. But they went from being newly independent, new family, everything, you know, on their own, to dependent again. And I wanted to read a few remarks that they said on their blog about that transition for them.
Do you want the next slide?
Yeah, here they were at Christmas. Oops, hang on just a second. Okay. So this is Harrison speaking. He uses an iPad to communicate because he can no longer speak right now. But he can use one of his hands to hit words on an iPad to communicate. And he says, some of my greatest challenges have been physical ones. I can't do everything I want or need done, and that makes me feel useless and dependent on others for everything. I want to brush my own teeth and wash my own face. But I haven't done anything like that for a whole year. All of these hard things are hard to deal with in my mind. I don't understand my role as a husband anymore because it looks completely different from my new vantage point. I can't hug or kiss Haley whenever I want. I have to wait to have help for any act of love that I show her, and that can be one of the most heartbreaking things I have to face these days. And Haley goes on and says something, and this is one of the reasons I really wanted to read this. She says, I can absolutely identify with feeling dependent. She's saying, I understand Harrison, what he's saying there. One of my greatest challenges has been taking what seems like 3 steps back into being a child again. Harrison and I have lost our independence as our own family. We have a hard time recalling what we were like when it was just us. It's not that we aren't grateful to have my parents help each day at home, appointments, etc., but we miss when it was just the 2 of us and we were our own family, and my parents probably feel the same way. The lines have been blurred there in a way that hurts. And in an attempt to protect any last bit of independence and distinction that we have, I may have seemed particular or controlling of others at times. I have been annoyed, frustrated, and sassy for the same reason. And now that's something I have to work on daily. Wanted to mention that because I love how transparent she is about her feelings about becoming dependent again. And I think that that relates to what you were saying, as at any time of life, if you are not able to drive anymore, or you're not able to do things for yourselves anymore, or you're suddenly dependent on others to make decisions or choices for you, that can be a time that really rubs, can be very painful and hard. And in your relationships to others at that time, when you are trying to, when you have been independent of them, being able to do your own thing, and suddenly you are dependent on them, then that's a relationship transition that can be very hard to do well. So here's a few principles that can help in these kinds of different relationship transitions. One thing is to avoid being self-centered. And I love the fact that she mentions that she knows that it's probably hard on her parents also to have lost their nuclear family, right? Sometimes having empathy on with other people, knowing what they are going through in this transition can help you to be patient with them. She mentioned that she's sometimes sassy. Sometimes she's asserting herself in ways that maybe hurts other people even. And an understanding of what she's going through and that maybe it's not about them can really help in that situation. Empathy, I feel like, is so key. I remember when my grandfather started hitting things with his car. And I remember the last straw, which was the parked snowplow that was way off the road. And he hit it. And they all and my grandfather was a crusty old Kansas farmer, okay? And he had been in charge of his farm all his life. He was a very strong person. And this conversation in which, when do you think you need to stop driving? You know, at what point are you not safe? was a difficult conversation for him. And he wasn't always very kind to my parents about it, even though they were willing to take him places and things like that. But my parents needed to not be self-centered, and they did a good job with this, I feel like, and needed to have empathy because they needed to understand this wasn't about him being mad at them. Was it? Was it really about him being mad at them? Is Haley being irritable with her family about her being mad at her family for helping them? No, not at all. It's because it's hard to let go of that stage of your life, right? And sometimes when you are the person who's going through the transition and you're having trouble letting go of that thing, then having empathy on the other people and understanding their situation can help you to get along and help you to talk about things, help you to communicate how you're feeling and why you're feeling that way and why you're really feeling that way, right? Because you might not really be mad at that person. You might be more mad that you're having to let go of something that you treasured, right?
This may change according to the culture.
Yeah?
This may change according to the culture you're from, because one of the cultures I'm familiar with, being independent is not ever, you're never independent. You're always dependent on the family. So
That's
this
true.
would not be as much of it.
That's very true. I think that this is like the whole independence thing and dependence thing is something that is particular in some ways to our American culture that really values that independence.
I remember how startled I was when at age 2, my little son said, "My myself."
Right, yes. 2-year-olds love to assert their independence. Right. Okay. Another principle here is just be patient with the process because transitions take time and it takes time to adjust to things and it takes time for people to gain their footing, to really know what's going on. And so sometimes you can just say to yourself, this person is in transition and this is a time when we need to be patient with each other. So some ways to apply these principles to our lives. How are my transitions and my way of dealing with them affecting others, right? Because really, almost any transition that you have, if it's a major transition, is probably going to affect someone that you're close to. If you accept a new job with new responsibilities and you're traveling more, or you are going to be more stressed out even, then that's going to affect your relationships to your closest family, right? Okay? So when you're thinking, so many times when we are in transition, we kind of draw inward and we think to ourselves, wow, I need to survive. I'm in survival mode, right? And we think about ourselves a lot, right? But it's a good idea to think to yourself, how are my transitions affecting other people in my life?
In fact, when we get to these since we're at an application question, and we'll get to some more later, but if you can just make a note to yourself about your answer to these questions, maybe text yourself a couple of key words to remind yourself of something that you're thinking about right now, that could be helpful.
Mm-hmm. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you shouldn't do your transition just because it's maybe affecting somebody else. Just because your friend is feeling sad that you're not hanging out with them anymore doesn't necessarily mean you shouldn't get married, right? But maybe you can have a talk with your friend and you can talk about how can our relationship change so that we can keep this relationship, right? Be aware of how what you're going through is affecting other people in your life. And think about how people around me are acting. Could it partly be because of their transitions? And maybe that can help us to have a little bit more patience and have a little bit more empathy. This verse from Philippians says, if you have any encouragement from being united with Christ, any comfort from his love, any common sharing with the Spirit, any tenderness and compassion, then make my joy complete by being like-minded, having the same love, being one in spirit and of one mind. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves, not looking to your own interests, but each of you to the interests of others. So that really speaks to thinking about others during your transition. I know that I wish when we got married, that was a big transition for our parents because I used to visit home by myself. That was great. suddenly I brought this city boy to rural western Kansas. And every time I came home, he came too, you know. And that was an adjustment for my parents, and vice versa for Marcus's family as well. That was a real adjustment to them to have. They had moved back to the States, struggled with adjusting to American customs, and then suddenly they had an American invader every time that there was a holiday. And that was hard. And I wish, looking back, that I had thought more about their interests and been more understanding that they were in transition as well. I was thinking my own transition. I wasn't thinking of their transition. And I think that it's important to not just look to our own interests, but to the interests of others. And this speaks to empathy. Be happy with those who are happy. Weep with those who weep. You want to talk about this one?
Yeah, I still remember one time when I, can you go back to that slide before, Diane?
Mm-hmm.
Diane, I came home and Diane was telling me about how she had difficulty with the kids. And I was like, okay, I'll go try and fix it or whatever, you know. And she was like, so you don't care about me? And I was like, what? I just said I was going to try and fix it. To me, I was trying to, you know, show love. But she was like, I can fix it. I just want someone to care, you know, to care, to share my pain. And I didn't mean to make you look bad there, Diane. Diane
It's fine. It's okay.
Diane was right.
They all know already. It's okay.
Diane was right. I meant to make myself, you know, to say that I had something to change and I had something to grow, because often that is the biggest job we can do for somebody, is to sit there and listen and care and enter into their joy, enter into their sadness, right? Can you go to the next slide? So she already mentioned in-laws, about trying not to take negativity personally, so I won't continue with that one. But I'll go down to the second one down here. When you struggle, remember that it's hard for those around you. I realized recently that there is something that I have kind of indulged in sadness about for 10 years. And I'm generally a happy person, but when it comes to this topic, I'm always sad. And when I think about Diane, I think, well, she should just join me in my sadness, not try to fix it, just be sad with me about this thing. And that's good for her to try to do that, but that's unfair for me to ask her to do that for 10 years. And I might think to myself, oh, but it's just me, it's my life. If I want to be sad about that thing, I can. But it's not just about me. It has been, I would say, the hardest thing for Diane in our marriage, to have to live with that. And so I need to let myself be healed. And, you know, you hear stories about people who are close to death, and whether they die or not often depends on whether they want to live, right? That will. And so I'm just believing that that applies to me too, and praying that God will help me to find healing and to move forward in that aspect of my life.
Marcus, bring up the point that, I don't know if you guys ever heard of Dennis Prager, but he's a radio talk show host, but he's also written a few books, and one of his books is called Happiness is a Serious Problem. And he hits this point about that we all have an obligation to be happy because it affects the people around us. You know, it's not to make us happy, but it's to help the other people around us also to experience happiness. So in a way, it's a others-centered thing to maintain your happiness, in a way. And it's a really good book. He gets into some deep stuff, but you bring that out, and it's. Thank you for sharing that. That was good.
Because in all this, as you've been talking, I've been thinking, man, I just stay in touch with how I feel, and if it starts, I stop and what's going on. I cannot take, I will not accept going down and something's going on, I'm going to figure it out what it is, God's going to help me, we're going to get back to me. And that's just how I deal with. What's the name of that book?
It's called Happiness is a Serious Problem by Dennis Prager.
Oh, why did you say problem? Why did you call it a?
Yes.
The point is true.
That's
Yeah.
right.
Yeah, it affects everyone
Yeah.
around us.
Yeah. And I just want to say one more thing about this, and then you can go to the next slide, and that is, you have to keep all these things in balance. And so on the one hand, I'm saying, yeah, get happy, but on the other hand, you still have to share things. I don't remember who said this quote, but people change and they forget to tell each other. And relationships are valuable if we share ourselves with each other. So on the one hand, we don't want to burden each other too much, but on the other hand, we still have to keep sharing in some way.
That's right. And allow ourselves. Sometimes it's appropriate to grieve sometimes. It's appropriate to be sad sometimes. Jesus was sad sometimes. So just know when it's appropriate, right? So, and I missed one of the principles earlier in a slide. I'm not going to arrow back to it, but let's talk for just a second about that communication aspect. Because I feel like in my transitions, the ones that I've communicated well with the people in the relationship, those are the relationships that have done better and had less conflict because we're being open with each other. Here is an example, retirement. William Bridges in his book talks about a guy who had been a manager, very in control, did everything, and had everything going very efficiently for all of his working career. He retires, he goes home in the first couple of days. He rearranges the kitchen completely, alphabetizes everything, labels all the shelves, and the wife. Well, you can imagine what the wife thought.
When she came home, right?
Yes, when she came home, because he did it while she was gone. And so this is a situation where there's a transition going on, and some communication about what is going to, who's going to do what now, and how are we going to relate, and trying different things, and just realizing we are in transition, so things might not go smoothly right away, but let's be patient with each other, let's communicate, let's talk about things. That can help so much. I am having so much trouble getting this thing off. Let's see here. There we go.
Okay, the communication is really important because a lot of the changes that are going on are internal, and the other individual does not know what's going on inside you. So the way you're reacting, they may not understand until you sit down with them and say, "This is what I'm feeling, and this is probably why I'm acting this way," and then you can talk about how to get past that.
Yes. So absolutely, communication is so important. Yeah.
The way my wife would communicate that is she'd tell you, "Get out of my kitchen."
Yeah, I think that was the basic, the basic gist of what the wife did say in that case. But we have a guy who's going through transition, who needs to be involved in things, who needs to be able to use his gifts. He needs to let go, maybe, of some of the things that was part of that job, but he's not going to let go of himself. And so, finding ways for him to be able to invest in a new beginning. And that's something that you can communicate about. That's something that you can do together, right? So, so that communication is really important.
And it clears up communication to externalize the problem and say my problem is not you, your problem is not me. Our problem is this thing, and finding a way that we can solve it will often involve some kind of compromise. It'll often involve, you changing something and me changing something.
And there's going to be a neutral zone there, where you're not really sure what's going on or what the new beginning is going to look like. But that's where that trust in God comes in. That's where that faith comes in, that we believe that there is going to be a new normal that's valuable, that is something that is just as valuable as the previous stage, right? Even in the case of like Haley and Harrison, you can think to yourself, how can that be valuable to go to a state of dependence? But they have done it. If you read their blog, it's a very powerful blog, especially when you think about commitment and marriage and some of those issues. But because they have kept their eyes firmly on the Lord and have nurtured their trust in the Lord and have nurtured their love for each other despite this. And so here they're in this state of complete dependence. How can that give glory to God? Absolutely, it can give glory to God. It is giving glory to God for them. And I think people who go to a state of dependence gracefully give honor to God in a very special way. And that new beginning can be something that's very special. It's not the same as what it was before, but we have to trust that it's going to be something good. Okay, last principle here is, and it has to do with beginnings, is show initiative, show interest in another person's transition. I think back to when we got married, we each had friends, and those friends who invested, my friends who invested in getting to know Marcus and in getting to know us as a couple, those are the friendships that are still strong today. I had a few friends who were like, him or something like that, you know, and they didn't really want to get to know him. They didn't really want to, they missed it just being me and them, you know. These are friendships that I was really close to. And I'm not really that close to them anymore because they wouldn't invest in the new normal, okay? They were holding on too much to what was in the past. They weren't willing to invest in what was the future. And so showing interest in another person's dreams, showing interest in their new beginning, even if it's changed to the dynamic of your relationship. When Marcus changed professions, we'd been married for, 17 years? And 14 years of that, he had been a missionary. And I was very involved in that. And we talked about mission work together, and we did stuff together. And it was something that we were really a team about. He became a web developer. That really changed the dynamic of our relationship because I had zero interest in web development. I had zero knowledge of computer programming or anything like that. And I had to really work hard to invest in getting to know what he was interested in, getting to where I could be conversant in it a little bit. I don't know, as much as he knows, but I know enough that I know kind of a little bit about what he's doing so that he can tell me about his day. And, mission work was a central part of our marriage for a while, but it wasn't the foundation of our marriage. And we needed to be able to adapt. And we needed to be able to show initiative in our marriage in other ways and invest in our marriage in other ways so that we could have a new beginning in our marriage in that way and let go of that was that way and start something new. Anything you want to add there? Okay,
That's
I'm going
good.
to give you the clicker then.
Okay. All right, so process these questions. Have you been feeling bad about changes in any of your relationships? Are you feeling bad that things aren't the way they used to be in one of your relationships or some of your relationships? If are your relationship changes partly beyond your control? Are there old ways of relating that you need to let go of, trusting God?
Because, okay, so my latest struggle with my emotions was Stan, the homeowner where I live, started driving for Lyft. So he was gone when I woke up. He leaves anywhere between 5 and 7 a.m. And I couldn't tell it at the beginning. Oh, it happened right before I broke my leg. So I was all happy in rehab and stuff, but I came home, my spirit went down to the ground. Every morning I woke up and there was such pain, such agony. So anyway, it took me, I talked to Jim, was he suffering that, thinking it was about my leg? Make a long story short, what I found out changes. I felt bad because his schedule changed, so the other roommate had always been gone in the morning. Now the house was empty when I woke up in the morning, and I realized how empty, how bad that made me feel. Thank goodness for my kitty. But anyway, they're beyond my control. That's what Stan's going to do, and and it took me a long time with prayer and talking to God, waking up, and for about a week now I felt normal, but it's been a horrible transition, big pain. But again, it's not stuffing, but it's also not accepting. I didn't know what it was about, but I was gonna get to it, and God was gonna help me change. That's what we can know about God.
Right, right. Good, thank you. So yeah, if you have your own answers to those questions, then please, make a note or a mental note or whatever you need to do. Are there new ways of relating that you need to invest in and embrace? All right. Now, Diane said last principle, but there's still some more. As you can see from the clock, there's still some more class to go. So, Jesus was having a transition in his relationship with his disciples, as he was about to die and come back to life, go to heaven, and send the Holy Spirit, all those things. End of the Gospels, beginning of Acts. So let's just look at a few points of how he dealt with that. One of them is here. He took bread, gave thanks, and broke it. He's been explaining to them over and over again that he's going to die. They're having trouble grasping that, but he helps them to process it. He forces them to have this tangible experience. So that's why we have funerals, right? Because they help us. Okay, so other ceremonies can help us with all our transitions. We can have some kind of ceremonies that we can do it with others, not just by ourselves. Relationships can help us to do those endings together. And so that's what he does. He says, "This is my body given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." In the same way, after the supper, he took the cup, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood, which is poured out for you. The hand of him who is going to betray me is with mine on the table." So he's helping them to process it with him. And then about Judas, Judas was changing that relationship, becoming frustrated with Jesus, not liking Jesus anymore, wanting to betray Jesus. So Jesus could have panicked or felt like he needed to try and force Judas to do what he wanted, try to control, but you can't really do that. You mustn't do that, right? You have to let people go. You have to let people do what they're going to do. And Jesus did that. Jesus told them, "What you're about to do, do quickly." He didn't try to force or control Judas. John 16, he says, "Now I'm going to the one who sent me. None of you asks, 'Where are you going?' Rather, you're filled with grief because I've said these things." Okay, so the disciples are focused on their own grief to the point that they can't even ask normal questions. All right? Jesus could be also focused on his own grief to the point that he wouldn't care about them. You would think he would kind of have an excuse to be self-centered, right? But he's not. He's thinking about them and what they need. So he explains, "It's for your good that I'm going away. Unless I go away, the advocate will not come to you. If I go, I will send him to you." So he's thinking not just about himself and his needs. He's thinking about them and their needs and helping them to see the positives of this transition and hopefully to embrace it. Not that he's forcing them to do that, but he's giving them reasons to. Then he said to them, "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Stay here and keep watch with me." Now, it didn't end up working out like he wanted, but at least he's trying to lean on his friends. He's trying to make it a communal suffering and not just him by himself. He's going through this. This is partly his ending, and it's partly his neutral zone or his wilderness, where he's trying to figure out what direction to go. And he's trying to do it with his friends. "Simon, Simon," Jesus said, "Satan has asked to sift all of you as wheat, but I have prayed for you, Simon, that your faith may not fail. And when you have turned back, strengthen your brothers." So when he says, "when you have turned back," he's revealing two things. One, which he makes explicit soon, and that is he knows that Peter is going to lose his faith, is going to turn away from Jesus, is going to betray Jesus or deny Jesus. But the other thing that he implies here is he knows that Peter's going to turn back again. That Peter's loss of faith, his turning away from his friendship with Jesus, is a temporary thing that is part of this transition that Jesus and Peter are going through. And Jesus has hope that Peter is going to turn back. And that's why I put that other verse up. I didn't mention where it came from. It's from 1 Corinthians 13, that says, "Love always believes, always hopes." And that's such an important part, right, of not becoming impatient, but realizing that things will pass and things will change for the better as well. Jesus saw his mother there and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby. Jesus is hanging on the cross at this point. He said to her, "Woman, here is your son," and to the disciple, "Here is your mother." From that time on, this disciple took her into his home. I think there are some people that even if they were hanging on a cross, they still would not be willing to accept the fact that they can't do everything anymore. And Jesus was willing to not deny it, to accept it, to adapt to the new situation, to allow good things to happen for the people that were affected by his transition. And then Jesus dies, he's buried, comes back to life. He spends a little time with them, and then he, while he's blessing them, he ascends into heaven. Acts chapter 1, angels spoke to the apostles, men of Galilee. They said, "Why do you stand here looking up into the sky?" So they're kind of stuck like this, and it's just kind of a nice picture of us and how we sometimes get stuck looking at the past. He says, "This same Jesus who has been taken from you into heaven will come back the same way you've seen him go to heaven." So they go to Jerusalem and they stay together, waiting for that transition, that beginning that Jesus told them about, the Holy Spirit. And they're all joined together constantly in prayer, along with the women, Mary, the mother of Jesus, and with his brothers. And so they're all there in the upper room together when the big beginning happens, and they're able to do the beginning together. Just like Jesus helped them to do the endings and the neutral zone together, they're going to do the beginning together, and that's important too. So this is the last slide. Applying these principles to our lives, do you need to lean on relationships to help with your endings and neutral zones, beginnings in your life? Like I said, if you need to make a note to yourself, you can do that. Do you need to help others by being a part of their endings or neutral zones or beginnings? And lastly, do you need to take anything to God or do anything for God inspired by what Jesus teaches you?
Just want to mention that last night we were talking about, we did a few of the slides for our kids for their nightly Bible story, and we were talking to Faith about her relationship with Rochelle. And this was something that we really had to talk to her about, was taking this to God, being willing to let, when Rochelle wants to not be playing all the time anymore, because they've been two little girls playing together all the time, and now Rochelle wants a little more independence. And Faith is having a hard time trusting God with that. And I think we often have a hard time trusting God with those relationships, especially because those are the people that are close to us, the ones that we really love. And being able to let them go to God and trust them and trust him with it is something that's really, really important.
Yeah, so we can take the problem to God, and we can also take the transition to God so there's two ways we can take something to God, right? One is as a problem for him to solve, and the other is as a gift, as a present for God. And that transition can be your present to God. You can love him through this. Love him with all the love in your heart. And that's the end.